Great, and welcome to this month's First Fridays. And today we have a very interesting topic that we've always wondered about with Professor Andy Piacsek. So I'm going to let Andy take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Fan. Thank you for inviting me. And as I figure out how to share again, just want to say that I've been, well, a little bit of background about me. So I'm a physics professor who has studied acoustics all my career, but musical acoustics is relatively more recent in my career. I started off analyzing sonic booms and doing other kinds of physical acoustics, but now I'm teaching in a physics department, and that really focuses on working with undergraduates. So over the last several years, I've been trying to steer my research more towards areas that are really amenable to undergraduate research, and musical acoustics is one of those areas. And it was a student who first approached me with this topic many years ago, and I kind of put it on a back burner after we did one preliminary experiment. And more recently, I've kind of revived it, and it's I'm nice to see that other people are interested in this topic. So, okay, I'm going to try to put this into full presentation mode. I've given versions, or some of the content that I'm going to share today, I've also presented at Acoustical Society meetings and at a European Acoustical Society meeting. But this is the first time I've kind of compiled a lot of this together for this audience. So I'm a physicist, and I come to this topic with what I think is a fairly neutral, I don't come with any preconceptions about whether playing in what I was going to find when I started doing this experiment. I just wanted to see if I could measure something. So just a brief overview, the scope of what I'm going to talk about and what we've been trying to do. I'll talk a bit about the background of the Playing In project. What is Playing In? How did I get started? What is the scope of what we're trying to do? Our methodology. I'll share some of the results from our, it's an ongoing project, but we're doing it in stages. So I'll share some of the results that we have so far. And at the end, one of the ongoing components of this research is a survey, which I think many of you on this who are joining today may have taken the survey, which I appreciate greatly. An associated research, and I'll explain the context, is also trying to understand the effect of humidity on the tonal response of violins, and I'll share a little bit of that as well. So what exactly is Playing In? Over the years, I've spoken to individuals, people who are in the music faculty at my university, who shared some of their own anecdotal descriptions of what they thought was happening. I've spoken with people at the Oberlin and the Claudia Fritz workshop, just anecdotally having individual conversations, trying to get an understanding of what people thought this was. And I realized that there's quite a broad spectrum of what people think is happening, or even what their conception of what do you mean by playing in. So I'll just want to start this off by recognizing there's a big spectrum of views on this. So here I'm just providing some quotes from what I've found online, just phrases that kind of show up repeatedly when I've talked to people. So what I've highlighted here, a play-in period provides the best sound from an instrument. Could take years of playing. So there's this issue of the scale of time needed for this effect to take place. This product, the tone right, claims that it can shorten the play-in time from years to just a few weeks. So these are just quotes from the tone right site, and Jeff Ziegler from Kronos Quartet is a devoted tone right user. Here's a quote from Carleen Hutchins from the Catgut Society Journal from about 25 years ago. string players are well acquainted with the need for playing in a new instrument to obtain increased ease of playing as well as overall smoothness of response. And I'll call your attention to the two facets of what she's claiming here, is that it's not just the response of the violin, but also, you know, what we hear, but also the ease of playing, this playability component. And so later, when I talk about the survey, I'll mention how I'm trying to drill down a bit more on those two separate issues of what playing in can do to what we hear in terms of the violin's response, but also how a performer might feel is changing with the instrument as they play it. So a lot of the examples here are from the violin community, but I also know, because originally the student who brought this topic to my attention was an amateur guitar luthier. And I know that a lot of guitarists, this is a big deal in the guitar community. Tone Right makes the version for the guitars. So I'm going to, it seems like this is applicable, this playing in phenomenon, to any loop family instrument. But I do want to make the distinction that of playing in, which is related to the effect of actually playing the instrument or vibrating it somehow, with aging, or the seasoning in the wood before you start constructing the instrument, or just the instrument itself getting older. Neither of those two things have anything to do with it being played. It's just time is the factor. There are, of course, adjustments that can be made to the instrument by the performer after they've acquired the instrument. Small adjustments to the bridge, to the strings, sound post. These are things that perhaps when you're talking to someone who says that the sound of the instrument has gotten better after they've played it for a while, might be discounting the fact that some of these things have happened as well. And then, of course, the performer may also just simply become more familiar with that particular instrument, and that can also change the way it sounds and the way that they play it. There's a reason why this is a very difficult topic, and as far as I can tell, there is no definitive study that has shown one way or the other what the effect of playing in is, because there are all these confounding factors. And so my objective, my goal in this, was to see if I could design an experiment that tried to simplify things to the extent that I'm going to try to control for these other factors, the aging, I'm not looking into what the effect of the performer's increased familiarity is, and so on. Just the effect of playing the instrument. All right, so what has been published before? So a little bit of background here. You can go all the way back to the early publications in the Journal of the Acoustical Society in 1937. Saunders observed that, he hypothesized, I mean, he was addressing this, he wasn't doing an experiment per se, but he was addressing this topic in a broader review paper. But he hypothesized that to the extent that playing in occurs, it could be that the top and bottom plates of new instruments are that may be what's changing. Cracks in the purfling occur as part of the aging process. But he did point out that if playing fatigues the wood in some way, that's not something you would want in the long term. Fatiguing is a non-reversible process. So this is not
box downstairs.
This is not something that you would want,
You want
over
lunch?
the long term.
Oh, there's like no internet up here.
Okay, I'm hearing.
Can you hear me talk? Oh no.
Folks, yeah. So quite a bit of time passed from Saunders' initial observations to more recent publications where people actually tried to investigate this. A short paper in Nature was published that a lot of people have quoted. Just a very brief letter, but it summarized an experiment where they did some vibrations of a spruce plate in very humid conditions and measured the changes in the damping of that wood. And they found that when the plate had a lot of humidity, that they could see the effect of the vibration in terms of the damping. Shortly after, there was a response to that, pointing out that, well, actually, so there was a decrease in the damping that was observed, and the response was, well, that's not really a desirable thing, and this is all kind of pointless because people can't hear that difference anyway. Kind of the elephant in the room, and that we'll talk about, we'll address that later on in the talk, because that motivates some of the work that Claudia and I are doing. Like, ultimately, what can you hear? Jim Bissinger did an experiment where he took one violin, a new violin, and it was sort of just a before and after. He did a modal analysis, and he found some measurable changes, but I take his results with a grain of salt, because he just had a single instrument. There was no control. There were some other factors he might not have been controlling for, like humidity. And so it's just a simple before and after, which I'm, as a physicist trying to teach my students how to do good experiments, that's something you want to be very careful about, is just having 2 data points and seeing a change in your 2 data points. Yeah, it's nice to have more than just 2 data points. Around the same time, Carleen Hutchins did an experiment where, and she and Ling and Killian did a similar experiment where they vibrated violins and violas, and Hutchins measured some changes to the response peaks. Ling and Killian did a listener test, and people thought they heard a difference. But again, the way those experiments were designed, I think, left something to be desired. Jared Grogan was my student back in 2003. We tried to approach this, again, from a very simple point of view of just, instead of a whole complicated instrument that has all these different parts and things are glued and all these components that might be making it more difficult to find out what's causing what, we just took the top plates. So he acquired some spruce plates that he would use for his guitar making, and we just vibrated those things. And we did these tap tones. We were very new at this, but we were able to get these tap tones. We used a pendulum hammer to make a very consistent tap, and the time signals of those tap tones overlaid on each other almost perfectly week after week. So even after 1,400 hours of vibration, we were not able to measure any changes to those spruce plates. And then in Australia, they did an experiment also aimed at listening tests. They commissioned these 2 nearly identical violins. One was a control, the other one was played regularly. And after 3 years, the listening tests were not able to reveal any significant difference. So bottom line, it's a mixed bag. There are, some people have reported some changes that could be attributed to playing in, others have not. So with my student Seth Lowery, we designed the following experiment. We wanted to, again, try to keep things as, repeatable and uncomplicated as possible. So instead of having a person do the playing, where the violin would be moving around a lot, we just kept our violins in a lab, and we mechanically stimulated. So we had 3 violins, one of which was a control, and the other 2 were mechanically stimulated 2 different ways that I'll describe. And we were just measuring mechanical properties, no listening tests for this initial experiment. We're just measuring bridge admittance and radiativity. And we were doing it continuously throughout this 2-month-long experiment. So not just a before and after, but every week we would take measurements looking to see if there was a trend. Okay, so we had 3 relatively new violins. They were pretty new when we first got them, but then COVID happened, and the experiment was kind of put off for a while, but they remained unplayed for the couple years until we finally got around to doing the experiment. They were yeah, Hammond Ashley is a shop in Issaquah, Washington that loaned us these violins. These are their kind of mid-range student violins. I think I was told they run roughly about $1,000 or so for this model. So not a particularly high-end violin, but not a a pawn shop violin either. We applied a force at the bridge in both cases. So in one case, we used the tone right. So I plunked out, I can't remember how much it was, $75 or so for a tone right that mounts on a violin bridge. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a very simple device. When you plug it in and turn it on, you've only got basically a volume control. It vibrates at essentially the 60 hertz frequency that you're getting from your AC outlet, plus ostensibly harmonics. And so when I measured with an accelerometer what we were getting out of that, that's what we got. The other version was a bit more of a custom job. I have a mechanical shaker with a stinger that I would glue to the bridge, and I designed the signal that that shaker would put out. And I wanted to do something a little more representative of what an actual player might put into that violin. So the power spectrum of somebody who's practicing classical music a lot. So what I did was I took a recording of the first movement of Vivaldi Seasons. I can't remember which one. It might have been Summer. And then a little bit of signal processing. I did a power spectrum of like that 5-minute long segment. And then I just did an inverse Fourier transform to get a continuous time signal that I looped. And it sounds like this. So we just shook the violin with that signal 24/7, while the tone right was doing its thing, also 24/7. So in that case, I'm putting in power spectrum of basically a Vivaldi violin concerto. And then at 1-week intervals, I would take these violins away from their shaking, put them into our measurement rig that I'll show you, and we measured bridge admittance and the acoustic radiativity. So this is what that looks like. So on the left, you can see my rig is inspired by Joseph Curtin's rig. We made it ourselves. I didn't need the full rotation capability of the mount, so it's just resting on rubber bands, and that's a laser vibrometer. There on the right, it's a scanning laser vibrometer, but for this measurement, I'm just aiming it at the bridge. I'm tapping it on the other side with the same kind of hammer setup that Joseph uses. And that gets us the bridge admittance, which is the ratio of the bridge velocity that I'm measuring with the vibrometer divided by the impact force provided by the hammer. So that's in the frequency domain. And then separately, I would take it into my anechoic chamber to do a radiativity measurement, which is same kind of impulse. I have the hammer tapping the bridge, but now I'm measuring the radiated acoustic field with a microphone. Actually, there are 2 microphones, the one mounted in front and also another one in back. I would take an average of 6 hammer taps for each measurement. And very important, I measured the mass of the violin before every single measurement. And I'll explain that in a moment. So as a physicist trying to take good measurements, my first, naive, again, I'm new to this particular field, and I didn't know right off the bat what was the state-of-the-art way of taking these kinds of measurements. I was very concerned about the repeatability of my measurements. Actually, it took a while for me to get to the stage where I had adapted Joseph Curtin's measurement rig. Initially, I was shaking it with the shaker continuously at the bridge, and then people pointed out to me that was maybe not the most reliable way of taking that measurement. So when I finally did improve my technique a bit, I still wanted to be able to basically measure my error bars. How repeatable are these measurements? With the recognition that I am looking probably for a very subtle effect. The effect of playing in on admittance might not be really obvious, and I'm very worried that it's going to be drowned out by inconsistencies in the way I do the measurements. So I needed to know right off the bat, before I started doing the playing in, how repeatable are my measurements? So what's going on is that you mount that violin, we go back, that violin has to be mounted, positioned there, resting on the rubber bands. The hammer has to be aligned so that it taps the same place on the bridge. The vibrometer has to be aligned so it's always aimed at the same place on the bridge. This act of putting the violin and positioning it so that everything is lined up, this is where the variation can come in. And perhaps there are other sources of other reasons why I might get some variation in my measurements, but those are the main reasons, that the alignment's not the same every time you put the violin in. And of course I have to take the violin out in order to put it back in the shaking rig. So what I was doing here, sort of in the best case scenario, if I just take the violin out just for a moment and then put it back in again, I have to go through that whole process of repositioning it, aligning everything, take the measurement, take the violin back out, put it right back in again, and 10 minutes between measurements in that process. And I took 8 measurements. And if I overlay those 8 measurements within that 200 to 1000 hertz band, the admittance looks pretty consistent, right? You can identify in some of these peaks that they don't exactly line up, but in some peaks they do. So that's a pretty small deviation. So then I did it again, but now I spent a day between measurements. So I would take it out, put the violin in its case, and then come back the next day, put the violin back in again, take that measurement. When that much time has passed, maybe it's just muscle memory is a little different. Who knows? But those measurements are not as consistent. And I think this is the more realistic kind of variation that you can expect between measurements in an experiment like I was doing, where I was measuring them every week. So I wanted to quantify that variability that you're seeing right there. It's one thing to look at the plot and say, okay, yep, I can see the inconsistency there, but how can I put a number to it? And also for context, so that those upper plots are just simply variations due to the fact that I'm just taking the measurement again, having to realign the violin. But what if something else is changing? What if, for example, the humidity in my lab is changing? So I want to, well, I'll call out now a thank you to Anders Boyen, who wrote, I thought, a good but published on the internet, but not peer-reviewed paper on the effects of humidity on violins. And I wanted to do a similar experiment so that I could measure it and quantify it in a way that made sense to me. So I will talk more about the details of how I took this measurement a little bit later, but you're getting a sneak preview because it's relevant to this experiment. I took some of the violins that we're working with and brought them to a building next door at my university that has an environmental chamber. They do this for the Human Performance Exercise Lab, and they can control temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. But I really just wanted to have those violins sit in a humid environment, because for the most part, it's pretty dry here in Central Washington, and my lab is normally at around a 25% humidity level. So I stuck them in the environmental chamber at about 85% humidity for a day, brought them back to my lab and basically let them dry out. And over the course of them drying out, like every couple hours, I would measure the admittance. And when I superimpose a subset of those measurements here, you can clearly see what's going on as the violin is drying out. So the reddish color is at the beginning when there's still a lot of moisture content absorbed into the wood. So the wood is heavier. This is why I'm always measuring the mass of the violin before I take an admittance measurement, because that mass is essentially a proxy for how much moisture content is there in the violin. So that's what these figures, these numbers here on the right are. They are the mass of the violin. This is for one of the violins, and you can see that as it's drying out, it lost about 12 grams of water content, which is about, in this case, what 2% or so of the weight of the violin. And so red is the largest mass, the most water content. Blue is the driest version of the violin. And you can see that there is a very consistent trend in the admittance peaks shifting to the right as the violin is drying out, which from a simple mass spring analysis of resonance makes perfect sense, that as the violin gets lighter and presumably the restoring force stiffness of the wood isn't changing very much, then the resonance frequencies of its various modes are going to shift to higher frequencies. And that's exactly what we see here, that for each of these modes here, and I'm not going to risk identifying every single one here by sight, but yeah, these are the main modes of the violin. They are shifting to the right as they dry out. So that's much more significant than the uncertainty variation. So I knew that I needed to account for that during the course of the playing in experiment. And also for context, here are the 3 test violins plus a 4th violin that I happen to have in the lab. And again, with the same frequency range, although this one is done with a logarithmic frequency plot, you can see how different the violins are from each other compared to the changes due to humidity versus the change in just the uncertainty. So for playing in, I'm anticipating seeing something that is probably going to be less obvious than the humidity change, but hopefully more obvious than the simple uncertainty of taking these measurements, or the variability in taking these measurements, because otherwise we won't be able to see it. Okay, so quantifying that uncertainty or that variability, I'm going to be referring to, well, the results that I show later are going to be based on this process here. So I just wanted to do a quick overview of what I'm doing. So if you just zoom in on a frequency band of, say, a little over 100 hertz here, that shows a couple peaks. But I've got 8 different admittance curves plotted here. Those are in gray, so you can see the variation. The blue arrows give you a qualitative sense of how much at each frequency, how much variation there is in those admittance curves. So this is what I want to try to quantify. So I'm basically calculating what amounts to a standard deviation at each frequency. So that J indicates that subscript is the jth frequency. If I've discretized my frequency response into some number of frequency bins between here and here, that's what the J refers to. So at some particular frequency, I'm calculating a standard deviation among my 8 trials. There's 8 in this particular example. And that's just a standard approach to calculating a standard deviation. And then I essentially average that over the entire frequency band to get a number that represents a variation for that frequency band. And then I normalize it by the average of that frequency band. So I call that the normalized variation. So I'll refer to that term normalized variation. Just keep in mind that it refers to, it's calculated for a specific frequency band. And I will, and I am basically dividing the frequency response from 200 hertz to 10 kilohertz into 3 bands. The first band has those primary modes, so 200 hertz to kilohertz. The second band from 1 kilohertz to 4 kilohertz contains the bridge hill and some other distinctive features. And then that third band of the high frequencies contains that fairly characteristic 1/f response that most violins have. So the values that we can expect to see are fairly small, so 0.005, 0.002 in that band. That's simply saying that the variation is 0.5% of the average for that band. Now I can apply this to any set of measurements. I just did this example here with 8. I can also just do this same kind of measurement to compare two particular measurements, two particular bridge admittance measurements. For example, comparing one violin's response to the control violin, and that will be a useful approach. Okay, so here's that humidity plot again. Now let's quantify that. What kind of normalized deviation are we seeing in this band? Well, I'm showing band 1 here, but I calculated it for both the first band and the second band as a function of the difference in weight. So if, for example, that the driest violin is my reference violin, and I compare or I calculate the standard, this normalized deviation of each violin that has more moisture content to that one, then I get a plot that looks like this. And it's almost, I mean, I don't know if I was surprised or not, but it's interesting to see how almost linear that normalized deviation is as a function of the difference in weight. So just to make sure we're clear on what we're seeing here, the bigger the weight difference, the more water a violin has absorbed, the larger the deviation in its admittance response is from what it was when it was dry. And it's a bigger effect in that first band that has the distinctive peaks than it is in the second band when the peaks are more, the modal peaks are there's more overlap, and you don't have these very strong distinctive peaks where even a shift left or right can result in a large difference at a given frequency. So now the big question is, having quantified the variation due to humidity, is the effect of playing in going to be discernible over and above that effect? Or can I somehow control the, in my experiment, can I control for the effect of humidity? So I'm going to have to, in order to control for the effect of humidity, there are a couple ways I can do it. I can sort so for a given violin that is being shaken, I can calculate the deviation using the original admittance of that violin before I started shaking as the reference. And then each week when I take a measurement of that violin that was shaken, compare it to the original, I call that the self deviation. But those measurements may have occurred at different humidities, so I'll have to sort them by mass to see if I can. That's one way of controlling for the mass. Or this is where the control violin comes in handy. If the control violin is experiencing the same changes in humidity as my test violins, the ones that I'm shaking, then I can calculate the deviation from the test violin and the control violin. And then in a way, I'm just I don't have to worry about the effects of humidity. If playing in or if the shaking is having an effect, that will affect only one of the instruments and not the control instrument. Okay, so what does that look like? This is the self-deviation of the violin that was being shaken with that Vivaldi signal. And I'm showing you the results for all three bands. So band 1, again, was the low frequencies, and that has the largest deviation. The self-deviation, just to remind you, is the computing that normalized deviation of this one instrument to itself before I started shaking it. And if humidity were not an issue, and if playing in had some sort of effect on the bridge admittance, I would expect this to increase in some regular, predictable way, perhaps in all bands, maybe some bands more than others. But so that's what I'm looking for. But I do recognize that humidity was not constant throughout that experiment. So this axis here is simply a time axis. So increased hours of vibration. If I sort them differently so that I'm plotting them, I mean, notice that there's quite a bit of variation from one week to the next. Big variation, less variation, middle, much less, much more, right? That's not what I was expecting. That's not what I would think that playing in would cause. Most likely changes in humidity were causing that big variation. So now if I sort my data with violin weight, then I don't see so much variation. It's actually, the R squared value is much higher. And I can explain away pretty much all of that variation in terms of the humidity changes that were occurring throughout the experiment. So again, that's going to make it difficult to assess the effect of playing in because of humidity. So here's the different approach. The other approach is to take the normalized difference between each test violin and the control violin measured on a given day. So now my x-axis is back to hours of vibration. And I'm showing two different violins. Violin A was the one that was shaken with Vivaldi. Violin B was shaken with the tone right. And I'm just plotting two of the bands, just so that this doesn't get too cluttered. The darker one is band 1. The lighter color is band 2. And in this case, so now the normalized difference is a bigger number because I'm actually taking the difference between two violins, not a self difference, but two different violins. However, if so both are being exposed to the same humidity, so whatever changes to humidity, now I recognize that each violin may respond to humidity in a slightly different way, but overall, we expect the change, the way it responds to humidity to be fairly similar. Those peaks are going to shift to the right as the humidity drops, or shift to the left as humidity increases. So, although I expect maybe some fluctuation, if the vibration is having an effect, I would expect this normalized deviation to increase as a result of the shaking over time. But in this this plot is not showing that. So the trend line for all of these, for each violin at each band, there's some fluctuation, but there is no clear trend. To put that into context, so how much variation is there? I'm superimposing the essentially the error bar that I measured from that 24-hour interval between measurements. I came up with that normalized variation that I showed you earlier, now I'm representing that as a width here that represents the range of uncertainty just from doing the experiment. And all this data almost exactly fits within that range. So all of this variation can be attributed to the uncertainty of simply taking the violin out, putting it back in the rig, and taking that measurement again. And so within that, I can't see any effect of the vibration. And I can do the same thing for radiativity. And there was a bit more variation here, and some of these dots are, excuse me, are falling outside of the that shaded error bar. But then I also, going back through my notes, trying to figure out why that was, I realized that so Seth, my student, and I were alternating taking measurements. And what I hadn't, what I learned kind of the hard way is that that's yet another factor for why there might be some variation in your measurements. If a different person is doing it, they might align things in a different way. With the bridge admittance measurements, I think we were fairly consistent in how we approached it, but he and I had slightly different approaches to how we set things up for the radiativity measurements in the anechoic chamber. And so I think that accounts for more of the fluctuation, is that he and I had slightly different ways of doing it. But again, there's not a clear trend of the normalized difference getting larger over time, as you would expect if some change was happening to one of those violins because it was being shaken, compared to the control violin where nothing was happening to it. So to summarize, we measured the frequency response of violins over a period of like 2.5 months, about 1,800 hours of nearly continuous vibration. One was a tone right, one was the Vivaldi with a mechanical shaker. In both cases, the stimulus was applied to the bridge of the violin. The control violin, it was again the same model as the other two, made the same year. That was kept in the same environment, but we didn't vibrate it in any way. And we measured both the bridge admittance and the radiativity. We developed that metric, that normalized variation, for just putting a number to how different two violins are, or how much variation there is among measurements within a specified band. And we had 3 bands that we were using for this experiment. When we compare the frequency response of the shaken violins with the control violin, we just don't see we don't see a correlation, that there's any change happening over time that we could correlate to the shaking. So that was our initial project that we did back in 2023. In the intervening time, I've sort of refined the data analysis a bit, but that data was taken back in 2023. So I'll also describe for you a follow-up experiment where we had students actually playing the violins. And the question about the effect of humidity has also taken on a life of its own. So Claudia Fritz and I are collaborating on a way of trying to assess whether listeners can distinguish the tone of a violin that has been subjected to different humidities. So these are ongoing projects. So very briefly, I'll describe this follow-up experiment. So it's the same 3 violins that I used in 2023, but nothing had happened to them for 9 months. So whether or not there was some effect of 2 of them getting played in, they rested for 9 months. Overall, they still haven't really been played very much. So I took the liberty of using the same 3 violins. And now what was the control violin, it's still essentially a virgin instrument. That one got played by 2 students, 2 music students here at Central Washington University. I was hoping that they would play it a bit more often, but they kept a log and they ended up playing it about 2 hours a day. The violin that had been shaken by the tone right in the first experiment, I'm now using it as the control. And the one that was shaken with the Vivaldi spectrum is again shaken with that Vivaldi spectrum. So I'm using the same 3 violins. The control violin and the played violin are kept together in the same case. So the students always had those 2 together at the same time. The shaken violin I kept in my lab. This happened over 1 spring quarter, so about 7.5 weeks. And I took admittance measurements weekly, but there was a gap towards the end. I had a conference to go to and so on. So we have a total of 4 or 5 measurements. And then I also made recordings of students playing pieces on those violins. I recorded them in the anechoic chamber at the beginning and at the end. And so, yeah, Hugo, I believe, one of Claudia's PhD students, is going to be making use of those audio recordings as part of an effort to train perhaps an AI algorithm to recognize differences in violin tone based on recordings like that. I didn't make use of the recording data myself. So preliminary results. I have to admit that I haven't spent as much time analyzing these results as I would have liked, but I do have some preliminary results. So the same kind of plot that I was just showing you before, I'm showing the results of the 2 violins that were, one was played and the other was shaken. So the played are the blue dots for the 3 different bands. And the x-axis is days after the start. So this was the initial measurement where I'm calculating the normalized deviation of each of these 2 instruments with respect to the control violin, and then doing that same measurement after the first week, after the second week, after the third week, and then a gap, and then after 8 weeks. And again, there's not a significant trend of this normalized deviation getting larger over time, which is what I would expect if the effect of being played or being shaken was affecting one of those instruments and not the control violin. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about, to just have a couple slides, is about the survey that we're doing. So after doing that first experiment, I thought, you know, it was inconclusive, or I should say it was, you know, I didn't find any effect of playing in, but I also recognize that that's not the end of the story. There are other things to look at, maybe other types of measurements to make, but I wanted to get a better sense of what people thought about playing in, because I had only spoken to a handful of people before I started that experiment. So with Claudia's help, we designed a survey that asks some very specific questions, and I intend for the survey to go out to a lot of people. I want it to go out to luthiers and performers, both violin family and guitar family instruments. So this is ongoing. I've had the most success distributing the survey to people in the violin luthier community. And so those of you who are here who have taken that survey, thank you very much. I'll share with you some very preliminary results, but I'm still hoping to get more responses, especially among performers and people in the guitar family. So what I have so far are roughly 240 complete responses. And you just as the distribution of who has been responding so far confirms that right now I've been successful at reaching the luthier community more than the performing community. And again, mostly the violin and cello family more than the guitar family. So what are we doing with the survey? I want to be very clear about, I want everyone's answers to be, in order to be comparable, we have to agree on some terms. So try my best to make some definitions. Maybe these are definitions that are idiosyncratic to my survey, but at least everyone was reading the same definitions and responding to those definitions. So I defined seasoning or aging to refer to changes that might be happening in the wood itself over time, whether it's dehydration or other physical changes, depending on environmental conditions. The term playing in refers to whatever effects that prolonged and consistent playing of a stringed instrument would have. And here I'm emphasizing the prolonged and consistent playing to distinguish it from warming up, which is something that could be happening in the course of a single day, which is something I wasn't really aware of until I had some conversations with players last year. So now I'm making that distinction. Okay, so with those definitions, here are the questions, the primary questions that are asked, and then there are some follow-up questions too. So keeping in mind those definitions, please indicate the extent to which you agree with the following statements. And the choices were worded: strongly agree, moderately or somewhat agree, neither agree nor disagree, somewhat disagree, and strongly disagree. And you could convert that into a 5-point Likert scale. Okay, so the very first question is, the sound or tone of a brand new stringed instrument will improve with playing in. And to be honest, I didn't really know what to expect here. Again, keeping in mind that it's mostly the luthier community that has responded so far. But here are the preliminary results. Of those who responded strongly agree, that's what I'll call 5 on the Likert scale, 77. So most of the respondents said strongly agree. A little bit behind are those that responded somewhat agree, but then it drops off quite a bit. So the folks who were neutral, there were 24 of those out of 240. And then somewhat disagree, 21. And then the fewest said strongly disagree. So those who agreed or strongly disagreed were something like 2/3 or 3/4 of the respondents. Oh, and I should mention that I'm going to show you these questions that relate to the sound or tone of the instrument, but each one of these questions has a counterpart to where I'm asking about the playability of the stringed instrument. But I'm not showing those, and I haven't finished analyzing the results that I've got yet. But I just want to give you a sense of the kinds of questions that I'm asking. So the next question is, the sound or tone of a brand new string instrument will improve with seasoning, regardless of the amount that it is played. And then among those who responded strongly agree to question 1, this was a bit more, how shall I put it? The responses to this were more dispersed. More people in general agreed than disagreed, but it was not as, among the people who answered, among the 77 people who said strongly agree with playing in, they seem to be a little less convinced that seasoning has an effect on the tone, which frankly surprised me a bit. But this is only a preliminary look at the data. I haven't seen how this distribution changes with those who answered this or this. It's quite possible that those who disagree with playing in are much more likely to believe that seasoning accounts for changes, but I haven't looked at that data yet. So the next question, the sound or tone of a used stringed instrument will be noticeably different after a prolonged period of not being played. So this is the inverse to the playing in question. If you leave an instrument that has been around, that has been played for a while, if you leave it alone, is something going to change? And now I'm asking about the warming up factor. Will just over the course of an hour or so, will the tone of a stringed instrument change? And then I'm asking about humidity here. What I really wanted to do, and the follow-up question is important, would people think that the effect of humidity on the instrument be more significant than the effect of playing in on the instrument? And then just another way of asking that first question, is it possible to determine whether a stringed instrument is brand new based solely on how it sounds? And then finally, I'm asking about whether, what people think about these artificial methods of playing in an instrument, such as the tone right, some mechanical way of, and I know also that there are a lot of individual customized ways that people have of accomplishing this. So these were follow-up questions that I had. It's like if you are, if you have experience with artificially inducing a playing in effect, how do you do it? And other follow-up questions are, what specifically do you find is changing in the instrument? What aspects of the tone? And there I'm also allowing the respondents to choose their own words. So there's a lot of open-ended questions as well that have to be sifted through. Okay, the last thing I just wanted to point out that the humidity experiments are ongoing. The results that I had showed you before were what I call the version 1 experiment in 2023, where I put the instruments in a very humid environment, took them out into my fairly dry lab and let them dry out while I was taking measurements. In the second version, I actually set the environmental chamber to different humidity levels, starting with 25% and going up to 75% in increments of 10%, and put the violins at each humidity level for a 24-hour period, then taking the measurements. So I'm not letting them dry out. I'm actually putting them in at a target humidity level and then taking the measurements. And I did it with several instruments. I wanted to see if there was a difference. So 3 of these are the ones that I was using in my experiment, my playing in experiment. There was another one on loan from Hammond Ashley, drawing a blank on the name of the maker, an American maker. So that was a more valuable instrument. And then a less expensive Yamaha that I have in my lab, plus a couple of cellos, one of which was a late 19th century cello. And let's see, going the wrong direction here. And again, yeah, a shout out to Anders Buen, who wrote a paper that definitely influenced how I raised my awareness of the importance of humidity and influenced how I did my own measurements. Showing you the results from the first version, again, just maybe a little bit easier to see. And then the second version, again, still analyzing the data, and we're using this, as I'll explain in a moment, in our listening test experiment. So this is the nicer violin that I had, and I'm showing you just a broader frequency range. And for context, so the greener color represents the highest amount of moisture content in the violin. That's when it weighed the most. And then the reddish color, excuse me, is when it was driest. And as before, you can see a shift. The heaviest version of the violin has peaks furthest to the left, and the driest version has peaks furthest to the right. But up in the above 1500 hertz or so, this effect is even more pronounced. And before I had only been focusing on the sort of the primary modes down here, the signature modes. But it's interesting to note that humidity has, in some ways, a more pronounced effect at the higher frequencies. These are these have audio files associated with them, and this is I think this is my last slide. Just to give you a sense of what I'm working on with Claudia, and she has some students who created these audio files. So the oralization process involves taking well, a source recording has already been made using a violin that was instrumented such that you can measure the force between each string in the bridge. So as it's being played, you can record the force signal on the bridge. So that force signal recording for a particular short piece exists that Claudia has. You can use that source file and convolve it with the bridge impedance or bridge admittance that we have been measuring. These are the plots that I've been showing you to create the tone of what that the violin with that particular bridge admittance would sound like with that particular force input. And we can create an audio file. The advantage of this approach is that if you want listeners to, if you want to ask them about, can you perceive the difference in the tone of this violin from when it was dry versus when it was when it has absorbed a lot of water in high humidity, and you want them to listen to these two sounds back to back, right? It's not practical to have them listen to it when it's dry and then come back a couple days later after the humidity, or after the violin has already absorbed a lot of water. Too much time has passed and they can't compare those sounds. But if you can essentially recreate or synthesize the sound of the violin when it's wet versus when it's dry, and then play them back to back, then you have the basis for perhaps a perception discrimination test. I don't think you're going to be able to hear the effect here. In fact, I'm going to I've got another set of audio files here. So these are two different instruments, and probably you can hear the difference between the two instruments. So I'll play you that. Both at the same humidity. There's a bit of a lag between when I'm hitting my button and, okay. So here is one of the instruments at 23% humidity. And here's the other instrument. So hopefully when I played them back to back without my talking, you might have been able to hear the difference. More subtle then, because this is not the ideal environment for actually doing a listening test. You should be hearing headphones, and there's a structure to this. But it's a subtle effect, but hopefully we think it's still noticeable. Here's the same violin at low humidity and at high humidity. So we can talk about whether you heard any difference there. And that concludes my presentation. Yeah, a lot there. And I'm looking forward to the conversation about playing in and the effects of humidity. And just, remind everybody, these are ongoing experiments. So what I learned from conversations like this will help me design future measurements, a little more carefully. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. That was fascinating. And if you have questions or comments, please try to use the the raise hands function, which is at the bottom in your reactions icon. If you can't figure out how to do that, put your question in the chat and we'll get to it. Okay, thank you. All right, first person with their hands raised is Andrew Ryan. Andrew.
Hi there. I was curious why in the last question of the questionnaire it was worded where when you play the violin, when you play the instrument in, does the humidity change the instrument, as opposed to does it improve it or deteriorate? Like, of course it's going to change. I would think that the thing you want to know is, does it improve or does it? Do you understand?
Yeah, and well, I guess I didn't want to.
Or maybe how does it change?
Yeah, to be honest, I guess I was mostly interested in whether, to the extent that people perceive a change in the humidity, and I want to compare that to the change that people perceive in the playing in process. Asking about improvement is a bit of a loaded question, and so I guess I wanted to stay away from that. But I understand that ultimately that's what people are interested in. Are things better than they were before? Yeah, I guess one always has to make compromises in a questionnaire. You got to settle on something. But
right. I mean, I the base would be I'd assume that humidity changes the instrument. And maybe that wasn't the question. Maybe
well, so there was
there were two different questions.
There was a question about humidity, and then there was a follow-up. I mean, if I can show that again, if that helps, just that slide that has those questions on it. So yeah, question 5 asks about, does it change noticeably? And yeah, most people answered yes.
Right.
But the follow-up question was the one I was really interested in, is the effect of playing, and again, I'm just saying the effect, not asking people about their preference, but is the effect of playing in more significant than the effect of humidity change? And so one question really set them up for that one. So there were two linked questions.
Right. And those were all the questions, or was there another set of questions?
So those are the primary questions. Depending on how people answered those, there were some follow-up questions.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So if a respondent was very negative about saying that playing in was a thing, I didn't ask them a bunch of follow-up questions about playing in.
Right. Right. So you weren't concerned with their perception of the difference, but rather, was there a difference? You weren't interested in quantifying the difference. You were only concerned if there was a difference, or qualifying
playing in.
Yeah, or playing in, or whatever differences there were. I can't remember exactly the questions, but now I understand. You were just interested in, did they perceive a change? You didn't care about the change.
If a respondent said they somewhat agreed or strongly agreed that there was a playing in effect, then I actually had quite a few follow-up questions asking them more specifically about what it was that they thought was changing, like what aspect of the tone was changing. So yeah, I didn't want to show the entire questionnaire here. You are welcome to take it, by the way, if you haven't taken it already. In fact, I'll put it in the chat. I was prepared for this. Let's see if I can find my.
Seems a little unbiased. See, seems a little biased at this point.
Oh, I'm expecting or counting on people to respond just based on their own experiences.
Yeah.
And you'll still have those experiences whether or not you heard my talk.
Yeah. I remember answering Claudia's. She did this a few years ago. She had the same survey.
Okay.
Or a similar survey. Anyways, I won't keep you any longer. I know there's lots of questions. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you for your question.
Okay, Luca?
Yes, my question is quite similar actually. So maybe you can show the questionnaire thing again,
Sure.
since you had it open anyways.
Yeah, I just have to close another window so I can
Hmm.
keep track of this. Yeah.
Yes, so the first question to my mind is quite revealing about how people think about this, and I'm going to see if you agree with me. So it's saying that the tone of the instrument will improve with playing. That's suggesting that the effect that is happening is somehow aligned with our perception or with our preference. That indicates to me that it can't be a physical effect. Physical effects don't care about our preference. They're just random. Why would a physical effect ever be aligned for some reason with my preference? The much more likely explanation here for me would be that it's a psychological effect that could be aligned with my preference because it's a psychological effect. But a physical effect, could you explain at all, if there's a physical effect, why that should be aligned with the preference of the person experiencing the effect?
Well, that's a very good question, Luca. In a sense, you've kind of hit upon the difficulty I had at the very beginning of how I wanted to design this experiment. The experiment, which is I'll distinguish the survey from the experiment that I did. I was only expecting, or I only wanted to try to measure a physical effect without I'm a physicist, right? I didn't want to presuppose what physical effects might be correlated with our or a player's preferences. But I just wanted to see, are there some physical effects, anything that I could measure that is clearly correlated with the act of being played or being vibrated? And then so my thinking was that if I were to find such a thing, if I were to measure something, if one of those plots showed a trend, a difference in the bridge admittance in some band that increased with the shaking, that would have been a clue towards, okay, what is the physical effect that's changing? And then maybe ask the question, why is that correlated with why it's sounding better? But in the absence of actually seeing a physical effect change, I'm not quite sure where to go about finding why it would sound better. Now, in the survey, why did I ask the question that way? Is because this is I'm asking, and this is not the only question I asked, but it is the first one. That's the question that really relates to what people are thinking about in terms of playing in, that it is something that's doing something good to the instrument. Later, one of the follow-up questions is, especially with regard to the mechanical mechanism, like a tone right, I asked, if you used a mechanical shaker like a tone right, did you, and I give them some choices, did it improve it? Did it not make a difference? Did it make it worse? Or did it make it? Then I acknowledged that there might be a change that wasn't necessarily for the better. But my initial question was basically echoing what I've heard people tell me, that playing in is something that makes it better. So that's just the question I led off with. And I do recognize that there's this other difficult issue of connecting a physical change to whatever it is that's making it sound better. And yes, it certainly may simply be a psychological effect. I recognize that might be.
I definitely agree that this should be the first question. Like, it's correct, I think, that you put it here, because that is the question you're trying to test. That is what people say is happening. So that's what you want to know about. I'm probably one of the 17 people who strongly disagreed here, so I'm in the far minority. I recognize that. But from a physics point of view, to my mind, it is impossible to just answer yes to this question. Because there's no reason to assume that physics would relate to my preference. Maybe to make it more clear, here's a random violin. It has value X, maybe a frequency or something is of this value. And my preference is over here. The playing in effect might lower this frequency or whatever, or it might increase it. If it increases it, 50-50 chance, it improves my perception of this instrument. If the other random instrument experiences the same thing being played in, then my preference would decrease with playing in. So it is impossible to my mind, and please, if anyone like has any disagreement with this or can come up with an argument for why would physics be aligned with our preference here? If we can't argue that, I think we can just say this question must be answered no.
Well, that would be an interesting conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other question, in some other questions, when Andrew asked his question, you came to this point, I think, where you said, okay, first of all, I really want to know, is there a change? And that is the first thing that we can do. And I think that is something that we can answer. I could say, yes, there might be a change. What I find really hard to say in a physical sense is this change is probably perfectly related to my preference. There needs to be an argument for why would this be, and I can't think of any.
Yeah, so Andy, so on that, I remember trying to answer the first question, and because if you disagree with that first statement, I mean, the first thing you have to establish whether people think, well, in the survey, what their beliefs are, and of course, in the experiment, you have to establish the observation, whether you can or believe there is a difference, and then you can ask whether it is for the better or for the worse. And I remember disagreement. Do I disagree with it because I think I can't tell the difference, or do I disagree with it because I think that, oh, there is a difference, but it gets worse?
Oh, yeah.
Most people don't believe that, but that option was not open to me in answering the question. I think that's an aspect of what Luca is also.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
So I think to Luca's point, sorry, this is Andrew. To Luca's point, I think he's saying that, so if the humidity does change an instrument, it can make it worse or it can make it better on any given day at any given moment.
Right,
so,
doesn't matter.
Yeah, doesn't
People's
matter.
preferences may be different. One person might think drier sounds better, and one person might think it sounds worse. Yeah.
And I have to say, I'm with Luca that playing in does not make any difference.
Okay,
Joseph?
Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I had a few comments. One related to what Luca was pointed out. It does presuppose that there is something that can change about any instrument that we've perceived as better by everyone, and we've never been able to find that. So it does suggest more of a psychological change. At the same time, the physics I don't think is incompatible. Let's say it did change the damping or the loudness or something, and most people preferred it in a certain direction, but we just can't say that. But you are perfectly right to put it that way, because it does reflect a general belief. A question that didn't come up and is, do you believe the effects of playing in reverse themselves when you stop playing, when you put it aside for a while? Because that again says something about what do we think is changing. Is it reversible, or is it some kind of versus aging? It's presumed to be a non-reversible effect. Not that I believe any of this. I'm in those hard nose for most of these questions. And the third thing was, I think the very last question about when an instrument is new. This, what was the thing?
Cool. Well, I just want to point out, so that question 3 might be what you were just alluding to in your second question. That I did ask people about what's the effect of not playing an instrument.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it is there. It's just not.
Yeah, I didn't provide the response to that yet, because I'm still looking at it. But
okay. And then, as a maker, I'm actually interested in, though I don't believe that playing in makes a difference, or if it does, that it's goes in one direction or another. Nor do I believe that aging does, because our blind tests show, if anything, it's getting worse with time. But when you string up an instrument the first time, there's a lot of reason to believe that when it's first under tension, the wood is adjusting, settling. I think if you look at what is it, the creep of the wood, these things happen quite quickly, then they level off. So it's quite feasible that within the first day, week or so of being strung up, there's some specific changes that happened. There was some suggestion of that in the experiment, I think it was in with the Paganini instrument, where they just they'll string it up for a day to loan it to a player 2 days, and they did measure the changes and the creep and the reversal of that. But I've never seen, it's something I meant to do, string up an instrument the first time, do a test, and then every hour, and just some things like that. Because that unlike the other questions, for me, has a physical basis. The others, it's just hard to imagine what the mechanism is.
And yeah, that I like that idea too. And I'll just point out that for every physical measurement that we can make for some effect like that, it's becoming increasingly clear to me that it's important maybe to do a corollary listening test or discrimination test. Like, yeah, maybe I can see some specific regular changes in a measurement like the bridge admittance, but are people reliably hearing that change, and to what extent? And
indeed,
aside from preference, these are, if you've ever done one of Claudia's listening tests, these are very subtle differences in the same little short piece, and I'd be hard pressed to say which one I like better. I'm just seeing if I can hear a change. And so yeah, in the context of someone bringing in a violin into a concert hall and playing a piece, and then doing it again on the next day with a slightly higher humidity, would anyone really notice? I don't know, because given all the other factors that would affect.
Well, the last thought was what your talk suggested to me was that we do an experiment with the fans of people using tone right, and have two batches, one which the light goes on but does absolutely nothing, and another where it is actually vibrating. You can't really hear it anyway, or you could simulate that slight hum. And if it's not doing anything, then there's definitely a placebo effect, and clearly a strong one, because some of these players are high-level players, and they're not.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not stupid. So it would be quite interesting to study that. We don't want to make anyone look foolish, but
yeah. Well, I'm broadening my horizons as a physicist, learning a little, just with the discrimination tests that I've learned quite a bit from Claudia. There's quite a bit of psychology involved in designing good tests, designing good experiments. So it's fascinating. These are the kind of questions you need to ask.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah, so I'm going to go to a question from the message from Sibyl. She says, thank you for an excellent test sequence. I wonder if people are familiar with humidity cycling, which was proposed by luthier Alan Bevitt in an article around 1990.
So I've heard people refer to humidity cycling, but to be honest, I'm still not 100% sure what that is supposed to accomplish. Maybe someone else who knows more about that can chime in.
That was what my question was about. I was going to refer to the Bevitt experiment, but moisture cycling certainly makes some kind of change. When you have alternately dry and humidify a piece of wood, it shrinks and swells. When it shrinks, and then swells again, it never comes back. It never swells back to quite the size that it was before it shrank. There is a non-reversible change that takes place. And actually, to do this, I have built an oven where I put pieces of wood in, I measure them accurately, I weigh them accurately, and then dry them out until the weight doesn't go down anymore. So they're oven dry wood. And then I rehumidify them and measure again. And this is ongoing. I've had pieces moisture cycling in my oven for quite a while, and I haven't ever made any instruments out of them yet. But I think what is going on there, if you imagine that you take a fresh cut piece of wood and dry it out, well, it's water is leaving the wood, but you can tell just by smelling it that it's not only water that's leaving the wood. There's some molecules of something which can be detected by your nose, and I suspect that something is mostly the hemicellulose, which is soluble compounds within the wood. And then you rehumidify it, and water goes back into the wood, but the other stuff that left doesn't come back. So that is a non-reversible change that happens with moisture cycling. Now that can happen naturally over years or decades or centuries, but it could happen fast, which is what Alan Beavitt was doing. Anyway, it seems like you have started that experiment already.
I did subject them to some big changes, but not repetitively. But yeah. So
yeah,
do you have a sense of what effect on the vibrational properties of wood that this cycling would have?
I suspect, but I cannot prove, that the stiffness increases, because another thing that's happening is that lignin is a thermoplastic material. It's basically the glue that bonds the cellulose fibers together, but it over time becomes less thermoplastic and becomes more of a thermoset material. That's why when you bend a piece of wood, the best chance you have to bend it without cracking it is the first time, because when you heat that lignin and let it cool, it becomes more like a thermoset. It doesn't soften with heat the second time as easily as it did the first. And I think that might change over time too.
Okay, well, there's an idea. I don't know if anyone's done a thorough experiment with humidity cycling and then connecting it to vibrational measurements. But
I put up my hand, but
yeah, I see you, Sybil. Yeah.
Oh yeah, hi. Yeah, so the purpose of this humidity cycling, according to Alan Beavitt, was to speed up the seasonal changes, like imitate many years of changes within a month or so.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did was pumping moist, alternatively moist and dry air through the violin or the instrument by means of using a hydrophobic and a hydroscopic material, so that one would absorb moisture out of the instrument and the other one would pump moisture into the instrument. And we have done it because we believe that it has an effect. But it often opens up the seams when you do the moist cycles, so it's a bit tricky.
When did he do this, by the way?
Oh, late 80s, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? I agree with Jim, and I think that people who are treating their wood, we had a whole session on that, with heat and moisture, essentially removing hemicellulose, and so I think that would speak to a seasoning
making
effect.
The same kind of changes.
Yeah, it's a long-term seasoning effect, or you can accomplish it quickly. How much it affects the sound is, I've made instruments with both, and frankly, there's not as big a difference as I would have hoped. But the thing about moisture cycling, you don't want to do it when the instrument's under tension, because it will greatly increase the speed of distortion. mean, the instrument will distort more quickly if there's that cycling, but that's not really related.
Thing
to
that I
this.
think certainly is an advantage, not an acoustical advantage necessarily, but is that it makes it less likely to crack because you've reduced the amount of dimensional change with humidity, so you're less likely to get a shrinkage crack.
Yeah, and yet these old instruments do crack. Don't they? They get more fragile, I think, from other mechanisms.
They do, but after you fix them, they don't crack again quite as easily.
Really?
Yeah,
Good.
and it's since I work on a lot of basses, which are wider things, so they crack a lot more. Like a 2% change in width isn't a big deal on a violin, but it's a big deal on a bass. You know, that's a big crack.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So I'm
Absolutely.
seeing some interesting questions, comments in the chat. So maybe I'll invite folks to chime in. Kelly Sivi asks about blind tests. Do you want to follow up if you're here? Is it? Well,
Yeah,
I'll
I'm here.
oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah, took me a minute to find the mute button. Yeah, it sounds like lots of blind tests have been done in the past, potentially with previous studies, and I think the comment's been raised now in this discussion, but doing some kind of complementary test with your instruments that you're experimenting on to see if the players are, can they perceive the difference, and is this a placebo, and does it matter? And I also just wanted to throw out there, I'm sure the rest of the group has maybe heard of this other type of not a tone right, but there's the tone traveler, which is also really popular, and I guess it uses the frequency of certain notes that can be identified, and I don't know the difference in physics with that, but if that's doing something slightly something worth looking at too in your work. Thank you very much for the talk.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you, Kelly. So yeah, to your question about doing the tests, the listening tests, that is when I first approached Claudia, and she didn't know who I was. I wanted to get her expertise in designing listening tests and apply it to this playing in problem. And after working with her for a while, and I had the fortune last year when I was on sabbatical to spend a month with her in Paris, we realized that as a stepping stone towards that, it would make sense to try to do listening tests for an effect that we can clearly see a physical change, which is the humidity. So that's what we're doing now, is that we're designing these listening tests to very carefully measure, how well people can perceive the difference between a single violin that has got more or less moisture content in it. And because we can definitely see the change in the bridge admittance, we correlate that to what people can perceive. And that could be a baseline. If we get a sense of maybe like a just noticeable difference in how much of a change in the bridge admittance can people perceive, then we'll be in a better position to maybe design an experiment to test whether someone can hear the difference between before and after being played in, because maybe we'll have a better sense of what we're looking for or what range of effect we might be looking for. And then your second question about the tone traveler, I haven't used the tone traveler. I have read about it. I think I was trying to accomplish or accommodate these different ways of shaking the violin in my approach. One with the Vivaldi that has lots of frequencies that an actual player would be putting in. So if that's sort of what the tone traveler is doing, then I think I accomplished that versus the tone right, which has just a very simple 60 hertz plus harmonics. So yeah, neither one really showed much of an effect.
Kevin
Luke,
Crow
can I
is-
ask a question?
David Burgess.
When you use the Vivaldi vibrator thing, is there, have you observed a temperature increase in the violin?
I was not measuring temperature, but to be honest, just from a physics standpoint, I don't think I was putting in enough mechanical energy to really to change the temperature that much. Certainly not compared to someone physically holding the violin. They would be warming the violin just from their own thermal contact. The act of playing a violin, yeah, I mean, shaking can cause a bit of a temperature increase, but I'm even though I didn't measure it, I'm pretty sure it was negligible.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I can't find the raised hand, so I apologize for that.
Is that Kevin? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, just curious. I'm also I play violin and make violins, but I also play guitar.
Yes, Tom.
And I remember reading years ago that Martin Guitar Company, the big guitar company, they did this pretty much this exact same study, and they were looking at microscopic analysis of the grain of the wood. And what they discovered was over years of playing that the grain actually polarized, meaning that if there was grain that was, slightly, to the left or to the right, the actual direction that the grain
at a certain point
moved worked. Has anybody else seen this study or familiar with it? And have you looked at it?
I'm not familiar with that.
And then walk away.
And I'm trying to actually envision how this might work because, the cellulose in the wood, it's not a fluid. I mean,
let others carry
what you're describing sounds almost like, magnetic particles realigning that are embedded in some sort of fluid that would allow that to...
Right. And that's pretty much what their study, they were surprised by that. So yeah, kind of like, glass reforming. It actually moved. It wasn't a real solid according to that study. And I don't want to be quoted on it, but it's been years since I've looked at it. But if you haven't seen it, it might be worth just tossing in the research.
You've piqued my interest. I'll see if I can dig that up. I'm curious to read it because I can't really comment on it without having read the details of what they were measuring and how they did it. But you piqued my interest on that. So it was the Martin Guitar Company that... Was it just an internal study, or did they publish it in some?
It was the company itself, the research department did the study because they were asking the exact same questions we do. Why does everybody want a pre-war 1941 or 1942 Martin as opposed to a brand new? And for the same.
If you do track it down, Kevin, I welcome you to shoot me an email with that link. That'd be great. I'll keep an eye out for it. I have maybe time for maybe one or two more questions, but I also have a class coming up that I got to pay attention to. David Morse had something in the chat that sounded interesting. I don't know if he's here and wants to follow up.
Could I just ask you a quick question about fact? I don't think you ever said when you were talking about your various shaking experiments, how loud was it? Were you using a level that was comparable with actual loud playing of the violin?
Yes. Oh, thank you for that question, because in fact I did. I'm looking in my notebook here for the values. I'm not sure if I can find that page. Let's see if I can find a picture. Is it here? Oh, is that one? Okay, I'm going to share the picture that I had on the very first slide, my title slide.
Has to leave
and
in a few minutes.
You can see there's a sound level meter as well as an environmental humidity temperature meter. So maybe you can even read it there, 84.7. So at that distance, I was measuring roughly 85 decibels by shaking that thing. And although I'm not a player of the violin, just listening to it myself, I thought it was comparable to what someone playing at sort of a mezzo forte might produce. I was keeping it at a pretty constant volume. So there's so many parameters one could try to introduce. I did not vary the volume the way it would normally be done if somebody were playing it. But then again, the tone right doesn't do that either. So, but that's how loud it was.
Okay, thanks.
Any last questions? Again, I know that fans sent out a link to the survey on this mailing list, I think, and I think that's where I've gotten a lot of the responses from. So I want to thank you again if you've participated. If you haven't yet, maybe you can dig up that email from Fan, or I put it in the link to the survey in the chat. And also feel free to spread that link far and wide to other people that you know, especially performers. I've been trying to get the VSA to put that on their own mailing list. I keep running into roadblocks, but it would be nice to have more performers answer that survey.
You might try some of the performing societies like the American Viola Society, or
yeah, and I know I have contacts with the Cello Society as well, so I'll do that.
I don't think there is a violin society. A violinist once said it's because we all hate each other, but the violists and cellists stick together.
Yeah, right.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened to Fan, but
yeah, Fan lost email. He asked me to just thank you again, and I have to go pretty soon. We usually now just throw it out for open conversation. I'll be here another 10 minutes if but that was really good to have on the record. I think people have been talking about this for a long time without having much solid data. Oh, a question I wanted to ask you. The sound examples from the Killian Mead one, I heard that way back. It was very impressive. Do you know if they're available still? Are they around? I know nothing about them. I think the Canadian research.
The Killian, I'm sorry, the Lingen, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
One of the studies you cited was, they played radio, CBC radio through the instrument.
Yes.
Ling and Killian. Yes,
Ling and Killian, right. So that's published in the Catgut Society journal. I don't have access to it. I don't know if one can get copies of what they used.
Yeah, they were actually using there was Spiegel opening soundtrack for a famous Canadian classical music, Desert Island Disc sort of thing. So it was a very impressive experiment, and I thought I heard things, but I just wondered if they were around, if the actual examples were here, then we could just listen to them, and it was quite persuasive. And then they showed that the effect faded away after a while. I was always impressed by the experiment, but those were early days, and I don't know what.
Those are early days, and and the details are a little bit lacking in terms of what exactly they were measuring and how they did it.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, my pleasure. Thank you all. Yeah, I'm going to have to take off, but